When will I ever learn that some things for me are inevitable? If you spend any time writing code in the last 20 to 25 years, you most likely have come to know version control software. And in the last, 10 or 15 years, it's been Git. It is by several orders of magnitude more popular than any other version control software. And if you use Git a lot, especially if you're a terminal-oriented person, it's very likely that at some point you've said, okay, I have all these problems I have on my computer with maintaining state, with sharing my configurations between multiple computers. What if I used Git for that? And so years ago, I began keeping all of my config for all the software I use in a Git repository, in a single Git config repository. And I should have known at some point then that I, of course, would want to move my DAW config, both Ardor and Mixbus, into that Git repository so that I can always have the same experience, the same shortcuts and all these things across multiple computers if I'm on the road, whatever. And I made a video, I don't know, last year, 6 months ago, I don't even remember now. I made a video about my experience with Ardor and Mixbus config in Git, and what I gained from that. And at some point I had a conversation with somebody about that subject. I think it was on one of the Ardor forums, maybe, about that subject. And he said he puts all of his DAW sessions into Git repositories. And my first thought was, wow, that seems like overkill. Why would you want to do that? But I should have known at some point, given the geek that I am, that I would find the necessity of putting my DAW sessions into Git repositories. So that time has come, and I've begun doing that. For today's video, I don't want to make it really long. I want to keep it short. I want to keep it kind of big picture. I don't want to get into tons of details because I'm only, kind of partway into this process. I've just proved that I already like it and that it's working for me. But this is not a how to do this video or anything like that. So if you want to learn to use Git, I suggest go study up on it elsewhere. For those who have never used version control software at all, learning Git can be burdensome. It can be difficult. Things are done in a way that might seem counterintuitive at first until you run into a bunch of problems and you realize, oh, that's how they solved it in Git, and that's why it works the way it does. Which isn't to say Git doesn't have its detractors. I'm sure there are lots of those people. I've seen them criticize Git. But this isn't about a piece of software. This is really about just a way to make our lives a little easier and give somebody some ideas. I'm going to get into how I'm currently using it, why I use it, some of the benefits and the drawbacks, because there are definitely some drawbacks. So with anything that you're managing, and it's mostly text files. If you write code, you're using Git for mostly text files, but it also tracks binary files, images, audio files, whatever. But there are benefits to using version control software in general. And among those benefits are the ability to collaborate with other people. So you can give your source files, whatever they are, if it's a DAW session or a website, you can grant somebody access to clone that repository, and they have the entire repository with all its history, just like you do. And so being able to collaborate is one of those. I think my use cases for collaborating with somebody, giving them all of my Ardor session files as is, are probably fairly limited. So that's of limited use to me, because if I'm going to collaborate with another mixer, maybe they don't even use Ardor, so I might just do stem exports or provide the tracks. But closely related to that is to be able to work on a session myself on multiple computers in multiple locations and have them all sync. And quickly, I'm not going to get into detail on that for just a minute here, just to talk about the other benefits before I get into that. Another benefit to using version control in general, and I'll stop saying version control and just say Git because it's easier. Another big benefit of using Git on any sort of file is that you have an audit trail. So an audit trail means that as you make decisions and you say, oh, I like this code I wrote, I like this change I made to the mix. So you save your session and you commit that to your Git repository for that session. So the audit trail means that for every time you've committed, you can go back and revisit what that was. You can revert to any point, any commit that you make, you can revert to it at any point. That audit trail can be really nice. Obviously, again, in audio mixing or editing, the audit trail is just different than it is for writing source code. So it might be of limited use, but might also be nice. Being able to revert back to a previous version is really nice, because if you make a bunch of changes, or say you made a mistake even, the undo key is just, to me, very scary in a DAW, but having a more solid way to revert back is also really nice. And so using Git is not a backup scheme. But that having been said, you can get yourself out of a lot of situations, a lot of bad situations, by recloning from your Git repository. So if I accidentally bork my computer and the hard drive crashes, whatever, because I have a Git repository for a session, then I can reclone that wherever, if I get a new computer, new hard drive, whatever. There are lots of reasons why you might want to clone fresh. And again, this is not a backup scheme, because I already do meticulous backups once a week with rotating hard drives, and I've used that recently on a session that I accidentally deleted, which was not complete. I won't even tell you that I deleted it while I was trying to set up a Git repository, because that would scare you. But it was the case. But I didn't sweat at all, because I had a backup that was not Git related. But again, Git gives you so many options in terms of recovering things. So back to the second benefit, which is the ability to edit a DAW session or mix a DAW session on multiple computers in multiple locations. So I recently wanted to do a little bit of mixing at home. I normally mix in my office with a desktop computer, but I wanted to be able to mix on my laptop, which I've done once or twice. And there are about 4 different ways you can achieve that. You need to get your session onto the laptop. First off, you could use a removable drive for all of your sessions, and therefore it's just each session's in one place. That's a great option. It works great. I tend not to do that right now, just because I'm almost always on my desktop, and I like having one internal hard drive for all of my audio and video projects. So that's a personal preference, but another solution to that dilemma is to sync 2 computers. You would generally do it's just in one direction, on a local network, by either copying the files or using a command line like rsync. Or you could even do it remotely if you have a VPN and are able to access your one computer from the other remotely. And that works. Now you have two versions of your session, and it's hard to remember which is which one have you worked on recently. You have to remember to sync it back, or once you start making changes to the first one and forgot the second one exists, it's tough. And then anything more complicated even makes that even harder. So you could sync it from computer 1 to a thumb drive to computer 2, but now you have 3 versions of your session. And the older I get, the more I find various files in places they shouldn't be, because I forgot. Why did I copy this here? Is that more recent than what I have in my project drive? I can find a session and say, wow, did I edit this session on another computer? Why is this here? And so if you're copying to a thumb drive and then to a second computer, you got 3 versions that you have to sync at some point. And syncing isn't all that much fun. And the last way that's not related to Git is you could use a service like Google Drive, God forbid, or Dropbox, whatever all of these proprietary sharing services from big tech are. I don't use them at all anymore, and I don't even want to think about it. I don't like them, but there are all sorts of issues with that. If you use them on files that you share with yourself and others, you might know what those are, but I don't suggest them. So that brings me back to Git. It just works. And is it possible that I could make changes in 2 places? Yeah, it is possible. I'd have to reconcile that then either way. But with Git, I have a pretty good habit of committing when I get to good little, plateaus, a place of, where I've done a good change and I'm in kind of a good place to commit it. I will do that. So, and I just have muscle memory of committing it and then pushing it to the remote repository. So anyway, those are all alternatives to using Git, but recently I decided I wanted to do a little bit of mixing at home, and I started to do the thumbnail stuff, and I realized, why am I doing this? I'm a Git person. So I started with Git. I'm not going to go into a bunch of detail about how to use Git. This, again, is big picture. And so I would like to show you how I started using it. And it was, again, when I was trying to think about how am I going to sync all of these versions between a thumb drive and 2 computers that I said, this is silly. I already have the tools to do it. I should tell you one more thing about using Git specifically with a DAW session. And that is one of the huge drawbacks to you doing it is that, well, it's not a drawback to doing it. It's just that you can't fully use Git, most likely. So one of the ways we use Git in writing code and collaborating is that if somebody makes a change to their repository or a separate branch within their repository, I can merge their changes into mine. If my repository has changed or my branch has changed in the meantime, then there might be a merge conflict if we both change the same lines of code. And typically, you try to commit often enough and merge often enough that those conflicts are minimized. But if you know the code you've written, then you just have to parse some of the lines. But with a DAW, specifically Ardour, things are more complex than that to such a degree that I don't think I'd want to merge in that manner. And so the complicating factor is that Git's session file, and in fact their config files as well, are XML. And so XML is a text file, but it's different than say writing lines of code in Java or C++ or PHP, in that when you save a session, for example, and your Ardour session file is updated, there might be one little parameter or value that changes in it, but the block of code containing that parameter, what might be 10 or 20 or 50 lines, moves. And so trying to merge these changes, if you have a bunch of changes that somebody else makes remotely and you try to merge them, I don't think that's going to happen very well. So I would not want to merge conflicts. I would want to, if I was working remotely, bring it back to my desktop as soon as possible. And collaboration, again, would be limited. If I were going to collaborate with somebody else in an Ardour session, I would just have specific rules that would prevent having merge conflicts. So, but a one-person shop or just a couple people, you can avoid that by just not making changes at the same time. Okay, so let me get into it here and just show you how this is working for me. So if you're familiar with Ardour and the session directories that Ardour creates, you'll already know that there is a directory created by Ardour for each session. And when you name the session, that's the name of your folder. And then there's always at least one .ardour file with that same name, which is your session file. This is really the main thing that you're saving here. So this is, again, if I open this up in a text editor, this is XML. And so these are these blocks of code that could potentially move around even though they haven't changed much. But that's a 1 meg XML file. I think it's 1 meg. Yeah, 1.1 meg. That is pretty much my entire session, apart from some other things, notably the audio files. So my goal here is to put everything in this directory into a Git repository, include, most importantly, the session file, but then all my plugins with their various settings in there as well. What I want to avoid putting in there is the interchange folder And I don't know about MIDI files. I don't work with MIDI much. I might change my tune on that, but I really don't want to put, for example, 20 gig worth of audio into my Git repository. And I don't want to do that for two reasons. Number one, I don't like a Git repository growing from, say, 5 meg to 50 gig. That's ridiculous. But secondly, and even more importantly, Ardour is a non-destructive DAW for the most part, so these source audio files, unless I'm recording more or tracking more for overdubs, these should stay the same. So that's the one place where I'm going to be syncing these audio files one time with a new cloning of a repository. But for the most part, I don't want to track these in Git. And the other thing I don't want to track then is my export folder. An argument could be made for including the export folder because that's typically where you're going to export your in-progress mix, and I usually just write over the previous one as I make changes to the mix. So it might be good to have a record of that, but for my purposes, I'm keeping it out. And so I don't want to track that. I'll just sync them as needed elsewhere on my own sharing platform or whatever I'm going to do to share it with the client. And again, they take up a fair amount of space, and there's no reason to make that bigger and bigger. Okay, so I'm not going to get into how do you create a Git repository, how you initialize it, but I will show you my .gitignore file. Oh, why is that? Oh, there we go. So this is my gitignore file, which is what I just told you. I want to ignore the export folder, and I want to ignore the interchange folder. I might change this at some point in the future and do just ignore audio files within there, but it is what it is. I don't use MIDI, so it works for now. Okay, so that's all well and good. So if you know how to initialize a Git repository, then you know a little bit what I'm going to look at here. One of the hurdles to overcome in using Git is that it is first and foremost a command line tool. So I spend all day in a terminal, so I'm very comfortable with that. I don't use any GUIs, but there are lots of GUIs available that will make it easier for you and certainly conceptually help you with it. But I'm just using command line. So this is a session that I have open. I'm going to hit return there. So I have a terminal tool that shows me what branch I'm on, and then if there were any changes to this session, it would show up here as anytime I hit return, it'll show an update. So I'm going to go ahead and just reopen this session, which is this guy. And so what you'll notice here, Ardour is fairly complicated in terms of the files it saves, and it's pretty cool once you see how it works and the inner workings and how they made it happen. It's pretty amazing. So now I just hit return there, and my command line tells me that there is one changed file. So I'm just going to do a git status, and it shows me that instant.xml changed. I'm not going to get into lots of details about all the files here, but instant.xml is where Ardour saves some temporary changes before you hit save, I think. Regardless, it's not something I'm going to worry about. I'm not so much looking at this saying, oh, when has a file changed? I should commit it. My goal in using Git with a session is, okay, have I gotten to a point where I want to commit to what I've done? That's if I wanted to see what had changed there, I could actually run a git diff, and it'll be instructive at least in one place. So this is the instant.xml file, and you can see an instance here where a couple values have changed, but this is from left to right, old versus new. The entire block has moved. And so these are the types of things that you don't want to be comparing and merging. So let's just get out of that for a second. Okay, so I've done nothing here that I want to save, but I will show you, clear the screen there. I'm going to do a git history, which for me is just G shortcut. So this is a log of all the commits I've made. So I first created this repository 3 days ago on the 21st, and then in reverse chronological order, it goes up to the most recent, which is today. Is that today? I'm not even sure. What is today? Yeah, today. Jeez. This is why I need things to help me with my memory. So I'd already had a mix in progress on this, and it wasn't until I decided I wanted to do a video about mixing this that I decided I wanted to work a little bit at home and put this into a Git repository. So my initial commit was the entire repository, and then every time I made a commit here, I put a note, a comment on here showing what I had done most recently. Okay, so next step, I'm going to quit out of that log, and next thing I want to show you is just how I might commit something to the repository. So I'm going to make a change here. Let's see, how do I want to do this? Let's bring up the mixer and then bring up the editor. I always say the wrong thing there. And let's see, I'm just going to make, what kind of change do I want to make here? Not much, because this is an in-progress mix. Think. Let's say I wanted to adjust some region compression. And I've got some here. No, that's an EQ. Okay, so there's some EQ. I will do this so then I can undo it at some point. I'm just going to change this. I have a preset here, so I can always go back, but I'm just going to change that. And then, so now I've changed the region effect here, which is an EQ, and I'm going to hit save. So now, if I go over to my Git repository and do a Git status, now you can see a bunch more has changed. Git does a lot with maintaining a history and a backup and all these other things depending on your settings. So again, I'm not going to parse files here. I just recognize that these are things that change regularly. So your .arter file, your .arter.back, your history, and your instant XML change constantly. If you're to a point you want to commit this and you want to work on it somewhere else, then that's what I would do. So I would just do a git add everything and then git commit and made a bogus change to EQ, and I will git push, so that pushes to my remote, and that's done. So now, again, looking at the history, the top one is my most recent commit, made a bogus change to EQ. So now, if I wanted to revert that, I can do this in Git. So let's just do a git status here. You can see nothing has changed. So I want to revert this. So I could do it a couple different ways. I could go in and change this EQ, and let's just look at it. We can still see that it's had some changes made to it. So what I'm going to do instead, I'm going to show you the power of Git. So again, that commit was the most recent, but if I do a git reset hard, let's see, what is it? Head -1. And again, these are all commands that I use every day, so I know them pretty well. This is going to eliminate the last commit. Since I pushed it to the remote server, I have to go through another step, but this will remove that last commit. So now again, I see now that I have a change, so I'm going to do a git status. And so I can see that nothing to commit, your branch is behind. So let's just look at the log again to see what happened. So what happened was this commit has been committed, but it just moved my head back to the previous one. So now in order to make that live in other places I might be using this Git repository, I'm just going to have to do a git push force. Oh, there's a safeguard. I use GitLab. There's a safeguard here that disallows me from pushing to a protected branch. I can fix that really quickly. But what we can do here then is if I do, I'm going to go to Arter here and do an open recent and just open the same session again. Now that I've reverted that commit, then in theory, if I double click on here, I can see that this, because the asterisk is gone, my plugin setting, the parametric EQ, is returned to its previous state. So that's pretty cool. Now I could have done the same thing within Arter, but obviously if you make a bunch of changes and you realize, oh, what have I done here? For whatever reason you made a mistake, or you decide you don't want to go with whatever you've done, even if you've committed it to Git, you can undo it. So I mentioned earlier, I guess in closing here, one more caveat maybe. I mentioned earlier that XML files are different animals, especially as relates to, version control and trying to manage these blocks of codes or blocks of text that move around. There might well be things that I haven't accounted for here within Ardor that might be a stumbling block at some point. But this is really interesting because it's one of the benefits of version control. So I have known working versions of the entire session folder that I can revert back to. And just looking at the history there, I know that every single commit up until that one was something I wanted, and I know that it worked. And so if I've heard people talk about having corrupt session files, I don't know how, how they happened. Obviously, they wouldn't have done it on purpose. But if you have a corrupt session file, well, you have a fallback. You can go back to a previous version that you know worked. And so that's pretty powerful. Whether you want to spend time learning Git is a different story, but I thought I'd provide this information just as a jumping off point to thinking about it for yourself.